you all for coming this morning and for braving the almost April snow in Washington to join us. I'm privileged to be handing over the responsibilities for chairing this event to Susan Glasser, who is currently editor of Political Magazine, a former Moscow correspondent for the Washington Post, and former editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, who will be taking over from here. So on behalf of the Institute, thanks for coming. And Susan, mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Sam, for inviting me, and for all of you for coming out. I think the snow is an appropriate setting to have a conversation about Russia, Ukraine, and what's happening in Eastern Europe, where April snow is not unheard of. This is a terrific group today, gathered to talk about sort of what comes next in Ukraine after what everyone would have to acknowledge is the enormous surprise of the last few weeks. We're in deep where do we go from here mode, and I can't think of a more interesting group of people to have that conversation about Ukraine, starting there in Ukraine and then pulling back to think about and look at what Moscow does, what Washington does, what Brussels does, and we look forward as well to all of your questions and comments later in the conversation as well. Just quickly, because I know you all know who most of these people are, let me introduce our speakers today. In addition to Sam, who is our host here at the Institute, we have Keith Darden, who will kick us off today. He is a professor who has done deep work on Russia and Eurasia in recent years, and he teaches a number of courses that are relevant to our conversation today. And I think we'll get us started with a deep dive at what is happening in Ukraine itself and how to contextualize really the political situation, which I think doesn't get enough attention here in the Washington conversation. And then we'll move on to Ambassador Lee Feinstein, who not only is the former U.S. ambassador to Poland, but has a long and deep engagement in this area. Was just recalling for me his presence at the very first summit meeting between Bill Clinton and Vladimir Putin back in the late 90s when Putin first came to power, and we've been having the debate about who is Vladimir Putin for exactly that long here in Washington, so I'm sure that's going to come up today. But let's first hear what Keith has to say, and we'll get started from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. So as Susan said, I'm going to focus on the internal political dynamics within Ukraine. And I think that's the appropriate focus for this crisis. It started as an internal Ukrainian problem. It is still, despite the Russian invasion, fundamentally, I think, an internal Ukrainian problem. And it's going to require some sort of internal Ukrainian solution if it's going to be resolved. There will also have to be an international component to the solution, but I think ultimately the problem is going to be solved within Ukraine and changes in the governance within Ukraine. My point is quite simple, that the EU association process, especially the protests and the repression that followed, activated some very deep and long-standing regional divisions within Ukraine. The new Ukrainian government, both through its composition, in other words, who the new members are, and because of the way it came to power through a popular uprising rather than an election, is only exacerbating these divisions. And I think that's going to have to be addressed in the fairly short term if we're going to see stability return to Ukraine. That unless we deal with these regional cleavages, and I think we should treat them as fixed, not as something that we can change. We're not going to change the political culture of Ukraine. And we can get a more legitimate government in power, both through new parliamentary and presidential elections, and a more decentralized government structure. Ukraine will not be stable, it will not be European, it will not be part of NATO, and it may not be independent. To back up a little bit into the nature of this regional divide, I think there are two key protagonists in this regional struggle that takes place within Ukraine and has been going on within Ukraine for more than 50 years. One is the West, and in particular the former Habsburg territories in the West. So these are the provinces of Lviv, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Chernivtsi. And the other is the South and East, And these were the areas that were once known as New Russia. They were settled by the Russian Empire beginning in the 18th century. They're the largely Russian-speaking and Russian-identified regions, and these are the regions that are currently out of power and were previously in power. All the data that we have suggests that support for NATO, support for the EU, support for the Maidan protests, and support for the current government cleaves along precisely these regional lines. I won't go into too much of the details. You just take my word for it that all the surveys we have going back for the last 10 years reveal this regional divide. And I guess the key question is, what happens now that we have a new government in power? What effect is this post-Yanukovych government likely to have on this regional picture? A lot of commentary has been devoted to the presence of the far right in this government. Less attention has been devoted to its regional bias. And in fact, it's a strongly regionally biased government. So of the 23 total top government officials, 14 are from the former Habsburg provinces. That's 61%. And those provinces make up about 12% of the population of Ukraine. Over a third are from Lviv alone, 34%. There are 2 representatives from eastern and southern Ukraine, which make up about half the population of the country of Ukraine. So this is a government which, leaving aside the question of its political ideology, is being drawn from one particular region in Ukraine in what has been a historic contest between regions of Ukraine. And that's not likely to be stable. In fact, there are only 3 members of the new government that are not either part of Batkivshchina, Yulia Tymoshenko's party, from the former Habsburg territories, or part of the far right. And that's Volodymyr Groysman, the vice prime minister, Yuri Krodin, the Minister of Energy, and Dmitry Bulatov, the Ministry of Sport. Not exactly the most powerful features of this government. Now, we don't have data on how the population feels about the legitimacy of the new government, but there have been large demonstrations in Odessa, Kharkiv on Sunday, Donetsk and Luhansk, throughout the south and east. And this is despite the fact that these demonstrators are under risk for arrest for separatism. In the regional press in the south and east, the Ukrainian government is often referred to as the Kiev junta. In Donetsk, the courts have been refusing to act on the requests of prosecutors to prosecute demonstrators. In general, there's been a general defection in the south and east, large swaths of the country, from the government in Kiev. And I think this has increased the risk of Russian intervention beyond Crimea. And unless this has been going to be dealt with in some sort of structural reform that's going to incorporate these regions of the south and the east into the government more formally, we're likely to see further Russian incursions. Now, this is not necessarily going to be welcomed by the populations of the south and east. In other words, it's not that these populations are clamoring for further Russian intervention. The very limited flash poll data that we have suggests that 83% of Ukrainians condemn the decision of the Kremlin to open up the right of its forces to enter into territories of Ukraine beyond Crimea. And that's a majority in the south and the east as well. So these people don't want the Russian military representing their interests in Ukraine. They would like this problem solved within Ukraine. And there's a very simple solution to this problem. First, there should be presidential and parliamentary elections. The presidential elections are already slated for May. Parliamentary elections should be included as well, because it's not likely that a single presidential candidate is going to successfully represent all these diverse regions of the country. And we need new politicians coming from the south and east to represent those areas. And second, and this is in keeping with a large movement among scholars of the region, including some Nobel Prize-winning economists, that Ukraine needs to decentralize. Choose whatever word you want: federalization, decentralization, regionalization. Power needs to be moved from Kiev to the regions, particularly power over social, cultural, and some economic issues, so that those regions that are not in power feel safe and secure and don't feel like there's going to be just one faction controlling the country and imposing its will on all of the others. These 2 simple solutions, a constitutional reform that would lead to greater decentralization and legitimizing elections at both the presidential and parliamentary level, will do far more than NATO pressure or outside efforts to try and manipulate the country one way or the other. Those are likely to increase the cleavages between the West and the South and East. Certainly Russian intervention likely increase those cleavages, And I think that U.S. or Western pressure from the outside would likely have a similar effect, rather than a stabilizing effect on this situation. So I'll leave it at that and move on to further discussion.
Thanks so much, Keith. I really think your remarks highlighted what we started with, which is that often Ukraine is left out of the Ukraine conversation here in Washington, and I'm hoping we can all sort of get into what that means, because I'm really struck by the absence of a sophisticated political analysis of what's actually going on there. We tend to view this very much in terms of Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin, and not so much anybody else, which I think leads us right into to Sam and our host here, and the question of what next. Do these political fissures that Keith is talking about really suggest that the way is open for Putin to move more deeply into the heart of Ukraine?
Thanks, Susan, and thanks, Keith. Had the privilege of working with Keith on a couple of different articles over the past few months, a few now at this point, a couple of which are on the back table there, one of which is in the forthcoming Survival. So my focus in my brief remarks is going to be precisely on the question that Susan raises, and that really I think is on many folks' minds. That is, has Mr. Putin been sated by Crimea, or should we expect further invasions in Ukraine and perhaps even beyond? It seems to me, based on what has been said by Western leaders over the past week and a half, is that they're looking for any way possible to signal that they have drawn the line with Crimea. I'd like to quote a few of those signals. Last Thursday, when the President Obama, that is, announced the latest round of sanctions, he said, and I quote, "We're taking these steps as part of our response to what Russia has done already. At the same time, the world is watching with grave concern as Russia has positioned its military in a way that could lead to further incursions into southern and eastern Ukraine. For this reason, we've been working closely with our European partners to develop more severe actions that could be taken if Russia continues to escalate the situation." Later that day, a senior administration official speaking on background to reporters said, quote, "As we watch the Russian threat to Ukraine, to include threats to southern and eastern Ukraine, we believe it is very important to signal that if Russia further escalates this situation, they will be met with severe consequences." The Hague Declaration yesterday, issued by the leaders of the G7 and of the EU, that included a line, said that we remain ready to intensify actions, including coordinated sectoral sanctions that will have an increasingly significant impact on the Russian economy if Russia continues to escalate the situation. And another senior U.S. official today, quote, "The biggest hammer that can drop is sectoral sanctions. The clearest trigger for those is intervention in eastern and southern Ukraine." I could quote a few others, but I think you get the point. This is some rather clear signaling. The West is telling Russia in no uncertain terms, if you invade further into southern and eastern Ukraine, the gloves are off, and we'll move from individual sanctions to blanket sectoral ones. Now, there's no doubt that doing our best to deter the horror of deeper invasion is necessary. However, in the remainder of my remarks today, I want to question the assumption that underlies this emerging strategy, namely that just Crimea, quote unquote, is a stable, if to use a word that Prime Minister Cameron said today, unacceptable equilibrium, an endpoint to the crisis, after which all sides will sort of hunker down into a new, protracted, perhaps mini Cold War. But before getting into the details of the current situation and why I think that that assumption should be questioned, I'd like to recall one of the many sage observations that Robert Jervis, the legendary international relations scholar at Columbia University, made. Namely, that outcomes in international politics often do not correspond to states' intentions for two different reasons. First, outcomes are often produced through a chain of actions and reactions. I would add that in a crisis, this effect can be accelerated and amplified exponentially. Second, attempts to move directly toward a goal might actually move one in the opposite direction. So Jervis gives the example of a college student putting a lock on a drawer to protect valuables in an otherwise unlocked room, of course, which often leads to thieves targeting the drawer. I think both of these dynamics are in play at the moment in Ukraine. So I'm going to make a case that the outcome that all the Western signaling at the moment right now is trying to prevent is possible, if not probable, even if Russia's current intentions are to stop at Crimea. So let's start with that action-reaction paradigm, which I think is the most difficult to deal with in terms of deterrence. Let's assume that Putin's claim in his speech last week that, quote, "Do not believe those who want you to fear Russia, shouting that other regions will follow Crimea. We do not want to divide Ukraine. We do not need that," end quote. That is a true representation of his intentions today. The action-reaction paradigm tells us that it doesn't really matter what his intentions are. The events on the ground could produce this outcome even if he doesn't want it. And there are several ways in which that plausibly could happen within days. First, the dynamics that Keith has just described, when combined with Russian meddling, could produce the kind of unrest, civil conflict, and clashes between and among Ukrainians, leading to a situation that precipitates further Russian incursions. Second, even if Moscow is only interested in Crimea now, the annexation might easily cascade. Crimea receives 80% of its water from mainland Ukraine, along with much of its electricity, heating fuel, and telecommunications links. Russia also has no land-based direct access to Crimea. As has been reported in the last couple of days, the Ukrainian government has apparently cut the electricity to Crimea at least twice partially over the last 2 days, although the lights are back on now. But if the crisis escalates to the point where Ukraine decides to fully cut off Crimea, which cannot be ruled out if Russia keeps this current government in its current state of agitation, let's say, the Russian military may respond by seizing more territory. Indeed, even before the so-called referendum, Russian special forces seized a gas compression station in the Kherson region, just north of Crimea, precisely, one would imagine, because of these kinds of contingencies. In addition, Russia uses a corridor through southeastern Ukraine for access to its forces stationed in Moldova's breakaway Transnistria province. And there were reports last week that Ukraine had closed its border with Russia. If this is true, eventually Russia will have difficulty supplying its soldiers there. At that point, it's hard to exclude a scenario whereby the military acts on the ground, regardless of what leaders' intentions are. So the problem with the action-reaction dynamic is that it suggests further invasions cannot be deterred easily. Remember, under these scenarios, I'm assuming that Russia itself, or the leadership, doesn't want to seize more territory right now, so it would do so only if events on the ground left commanders in the field and decision-makers in Moscow with the conclusion that they must act immediately. At that point, the threat of sanctions is unlikely to outweigh the immediate consequences I outlined. But I think the second frame is which is less about the situation on the ground and more about the motives behind the initial Russian invasion. And to understand that, I think we need to look briefly at the way in which the February 21st agreement between the then President Yanukovych and the former opposition/current government, which was brokered by 3 European foreign ministers and to a certain extent Russia, collapsed. Or rather, how that collapse was seen in Moscow. There, it was seen as a coup installing a government deeply hostile to Russian interests. Further, it was seen as a coup supported by the very same Western governments that had just signed the agreement and suddenly forgotten it. Moscow feared that this new government could rapidly move towards the EU and NATO, undo the Kharkiv agreements that had extended the Black Sea Fleet leasing agreement, and so on. In short, an epic fail of Russia's Ukraine policy. To clarify, this is not how I view these events, but I do think it's how many in Moscow see them. At this point, it seems, Putin concluded that all the levers he had previously tried to further his objectives in Ukraine were useless. In the previous weeks, he had tried 3 other major tools: threatening a trade war, throwing $15 billion at the problem, and cutting a deal with the West, and none seemed to accomplish anything. So, in an act of desperation, and I would argue that it was an act of desperation, not strength, he ordered this brazen invasion, without, by the way, to this day, ever having admitted to it. My point here is that the invasion was mostly not about Crimea. It was about Russian interests in Ukraine. And the problem is, like the college student with the locked drawer, the invasion is about to produce the opposite of its intended effect. The West has responded to the invasion and annexation by drastically increasing support for Ukraine and accelerating its integration into Euro-Atlantic institutions. The Hague Declaration yesterday indicates that a large IMF package is coming soon. Bilateral packages have already been pledged. Over the weekend, the political portion of the EU Association Agreement was signed. And NATO's Secretary General announced on Friday that the alliance's intention to enhance, quote, the ability of the Ukrainian armed forces to work and operate together with the armed forces of NATO allies, and to increase Ukrainian military participation in NATO exercises as a response to the Crimea crisis. In other words, this support for Ukraine, which is completely appropriate following the Russian aggression, even if it is successful, might well recreate the circumstances of February 22nd, another epic fail of Russia's Ukraine policy. So even if Putin has no intention today of invading the rest of Ukraine, I highly doubt he'll sit back and watch if 6 weeks or 6 years or 6 months from now, he believes that he is about to lose it. After all, he has declared that the days when Russia, quote, hangs its head and resigns itself, swallowing its pride, are over. Now, I'm not saying that there's a better policy response that I could think up, in fact, I'll leave that to Lee, than the current signaling. I'm just concerned that it might not work for reasons other than Putin's current appetite.
Thanks, Sam. It's the old-fashioned time will tell. You've given us a long horizon, so even if he doesn't invade it in 6 months, you might still be right if he invades in 6 years. No, but I think it's important framing to remember that the tools in the toolkit, as they say, are pretty limited when it comes to the conversation we're having here in Washington and in Brussels this week. And I think it's striking that no one so far has even mentioned the word sanctions, which has been the major U.S. and European response as well. Next, we have Ambassador Feinstein, who I think knows a lot about what the tools in the toolkit are and what works and what doesn't work. And I'm looking forward to hear his thoughts on exactly what we do when faced with this set of circumstances.
Thank you very much, and my 10-year-old son will be hugely disappointed that I wasn't the one who used the phrase epic fail in my presentation. So, but before I talk about where we're going, I just wanted to make a brief note about context and where we've been, and to do so briefly, to say that the initial effort to bring Ukraine into association agreements with the EU were part of something called the Eastern Partnership Initiative, which were sponsored principally within the EU by the governments of Sweden and Poland. And I raise this because those two governments and those who supported them saw this initiative very much from a geostrategic perspective. And from this point of view, they viewed the decisions that Ukraine made about its future as having an impact over time on how Moscow viewed its position and future decision making. And they viewed that long term as something that would have, in general, a positive impact on Russian decisions. Whatever one thinks about that analysis, the point is that it did not reflect the views of the entire EU, or to put it differently, it was not as important to all of the members of the EU who were focused on other regions like the instability in North Africa and the Middle East, not to mention their own very severe economic difficulties which still continue. So the EU was not properly focused on Russia's potential reactions to this attempt to bring Ukraine closer to the West, and to the degree that it was focused on this, it did not plan or strategize on how to mitigate potential Russian responses, or to think about a future for Ukraine in which it could develop in its own direction without necessarily having to deal with these kinds of provocations. And back then and now, in a variety of ways, the race has gone to the swift. So we can criticize it all we want, and it merits criticism, but the fact of the matter is the EU is not built for speed. And Putin has taken advantage of that fact. first with his immediate offer of $15 billion of assistance when Yanukovych, I think quite predictably, rejected the association agreements. By the way, not for the first time. He had rejected them previously during the Polish presidency of the EU. And then, of course, with the much more provocative actions that we've seen in Crimea and now with the exercises on the border of eastern Ukraine. So the challenge for the United States, and if I can put it in these terms, the challenge for the West is to demonstrate that it is serious and capable of acting in real time. This means that differences, real and perceived, between the United States and the major Western powers need to be minimized, and that this needs to be conveyed clearly to Moscow. That the West, or at least the major powers of the West, view these provocations and their severity in similar terms. And not only is there a need to demonstrate that there can be a response in real time, but there needs to be an effort to demonstrate that the West is committed to a common course of action for as long as it takes. This is not easy, and it will take a lot of effort and a lot of continuing effort, just as it did in very different circumstances in the past. And that's, I think, exactly the context for this week's meetings in Europe. And of course, the meetings were pre-scheduled. President Obama was planning to have his third nuclear security summit in The Hague. And you have to give the president and his team credit. They actually had a pretty comprehensive set of accomplishments for this nuclear summit, despite all of the distractions. But I think it was also very significant, and I think it hasn't been fully appreciated, the importance that the president decided on the margins of the nuclear summit to convene the G7. The G7 has been a tool, to a certain extent in the past, convened to respond to a variety of international crises, even though it was initially conceived as an economic forum. The truth of the matter is it always focused on whatever the crisis du jour was. Not only does this represent a group that is of the major Western, to use an old phrase, industrial powers, it's of course also a group that represents the major Western democracies. And so it's fitting that the meetings of the G8 under these circumstances were suspended and that the G7 went forward. And that Sam mentioned the Hague Declaration, and I think it is important that it was released yesterday, even though some say it lacks specificity and believe it wasn't strong enough. I think it nonetheless goes a significant part of the way to demonstrating all of the points that are necessary, and in particular the seriousness and unity of the West, and in particular the United States and Germany, and to as well the UK. I think it's less important, Susan mentioned sanctions, and I agree. I think it's less important that the G7 issued a set of new sanctions at the meeting, which it did not do. But I think what is important is that it builds a foundation that can strengthen diplomacy and whatever other measures may be necessary going forward. And this is also significant in trying to work with the EU and in particular in the upcoming US-EU summit, because it's easier to work at 7 than it is at 28, but also the decisions of the 7 will have an impact on the decision of the 28. I also think that President Obama surprised some people on Friday in taking the extra measures he did to strengthen sanctions to include some of the banking sector. The first round of sanctions, which the EU largely mirrored, did not really reach into the innermost power structure of Moscow. But this round, and even this round of sanctions leaves plenty of room to tighten sanctions and to leave room for diplomacy, or to use the words of 2 weeks ago, an off-ramp for Moscow. But you're seeing for the first time in touching some of the Russian banks and seeing how the American companies have had to respond, and the impact on Russian markets, plus some statements from Russian business leaders of what could happen were Putin to continue on this trajectory. One phrase in the Hague Declaration that I think is particularly important that I wanted to highlight is this passing reference to a meeting of the energy ministers who will get together to discuss their next steps. Reducing energy dependence on Moscow is a long-term prospect. It's one that's been going on for some time, starting under Secretary Clinton, continuing under Secretary Kerry. In this crisis, there are some efforts underway to expedite these efforts, including some short-term measures to get gas to even to Ukraine. An important step in this regard, and not just symbolically, would be an announcement by the United States to expedite approval of licenses to European allies and European partners and others of LNG to Europe. Those exports are barred under present law, but the President has the authority to expedite those approvals with the help of the Department of Energy. Last point I wanted to address was just how NATO has responded, and I thought that NATO Secretary General Rasmussen's remarks in Brookings last week, and also in Brussels, where I was over the weekend at the German Marshall Fund's Brussels Forum, were quite interesting and quite pointed, even though not especially specific. But in addition to saying that the annexation of Crimea was the gravest threat since the end of the Cold War, he also said that the alliance was considering providing military assistance to Ukraine to deter Russia from further military intervention. Now, he's at the end of his time, so maybe he feels the ability to speak a little bit more freely, but nonetheless, it's hard to imagine he was freelancing. And he made some further remarks as well in Brussels. He identified 3 priorities in Brussels for NATO, which included reaffirming collective defense for the NATO members, as well as strengthening support for Ukraine. And between now and the NATO summit in Wales in September, I think it's possible that we can see some significant changes in how NATO looks at its positioning and posturing, particularly, well, in the NATO countries on the borders of Ukraine.
Thanks so much. I think this point about potential military assistance to Ukraine is a really important one to sort of pick up our round robin conversation on, because it gets right at perhaps what Sam is pointing out, which is what are the potentials here to destabilize the situation, even in looking at what responses are possible. And certainly when you look at what Vladimir Putin has said over the years, his objection to feeling encroached upon and encircled by NATO and its steady creep eastward is a pretty consistent theme, both of Putin's and of his advisors really over the last 2 decades. So, does that escalate things further rather than being seen in the context of a response? That's really what I wanted to ask all of you, actually, to kick off our conversation, which is Putin. We keep coming back to the president of Russia. We all agree, I think, that he's the key decision maker, if not the only actor in this crisis. So I want to ask everybody, there's a lot of inevitable finger pointing here in Washington and elsewhere. Were we surprised by Crimea because fundamentally we have misread or misresponded to Vladimir Putin in some key way over the years? And I'm just curious for everybody's thoughts on that. Sam, what do you think? Was the reset a mistake?
So the short answer to the final question is no, but I think we need to separate whether there were grounds for the decisions that were made to engage in on a number of different issues that with Russia starting in 2009 that produced a number of significant results for U.S. national interests. Regardless of who was in charge, the question of whether we misread Putin, I think, is a slightly different one, because it has less to do with U.S.-Russia relations directly and more to do with the way Ukraine figures in his priorities. And I think they're if not a misreading, then a lack of appreciation, let's put it that way, for the extent to which this is that is Ukraine is a priority that outweighs the consequences of doing something like they have done. And I think there was a sense that even if it were such a priority, that Russia wouldn't be prepared to do something like it has done for that. And I think that clearly, those who believed that were underestimated the Russian determination and capabilities in this context. But I do think it is a very Ukraine-specific phenomenon. That is, Ukraine is a priority beyond all others, and has been for a long time.
Keith, I'm struck, now this is not necessarily a popular name, certainly in Moscow, but at times in Washington too. In 2009, after the invasion of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, according to a WikiLeaks cable, told a visiting U.S. official that it should beware of Putin's intentions to invade Crimea, and that was inevitably the next step that Putin would take after having invaded Georgia and being greeted not with a dramatic rupture in relations with the rest of the world. Whether you think about that or not, obviously it's been quite a few years since 2009. Clearly, this was sort of a known unknown, as Donald Rumsfeld would say. We all knew the U.S. government has certainly discussed Crimea as one of its top scenarios for instability in the region for a really long time. Do you think that misreading of the situation, going back to this question of Putin and his view of Ukraine, has factored into the crisis?
I think there's a tendency, particularly in the last week, to try and say, well, we've known this all along. There are just a bunch of people out there who are misreading Putin, but there's this sort of essential, aggressive Russia out there that, only the blind did not see. And I think part of the problem with that is, in the 1990s, people were saying the same thing. Russia's going to take northern Kazakhstan. They're going to annex Crimea, southern and eastern Ukraine, parts of Estonia, parts of Latvia that are Russian. Most of those never happened. And that was, now coming on 20 years ago that we started this conversation. The question is, why did Crimea happen now? Is it because Russia's always had designs on annexing Crimea, and this was just the moment in which they were strategically capable of doing it? Or is it because something went terribly wrong in Ukraine, and that Russia became very alarmed and tried to take an opportunistic move and seize this territory as part of a very real strategic concern that they have? I think it's the latter. That on February 21st, the Russians thought they had a power-sharing agreement that would have kept their man in the presidency, and the parliament would have balanced that out. Ukraine wouldn't have moved one way or the other. That agreement was broken within 24 hours, and the Russians felt deeply threatened by that. I mean, the data that I presented about 60% of the new government coming from Lviv. Lviv is a very hostile, or not from Lviv, but former Habsburg territories. That's a very anti-Russian region. It is the only region of Ukraine that is pro-NATO. So Russia suddenly faces a real threat because of a change in power in Kiev, and they're reacting to that threat. They're reacting stupidly, counterproductively, for their own interests, alienating most of the population of the south and east in doing so, because they didn't want to be represented by Russian troops. But I don't think this is the unfolding of some historic plan. If it is, well, goodbye northern Kazakhstan, and I hope we can defend the Balts.
The full range of scenarios here, from super gloomy on. Ambassador Feinstein, what is your take about Putin and Washington's reading of him over the years?
So I would, I don't think I can quote Jarvis quite as well as Sam can, but I would agree with basically this observation. I did not personally find it surprising that Yanukovych chose to reject these association agreements and the comprehensive trade agreements. There's another letter in there, but in any case, but I was surprised by, maybe Keith wasn't, but I think many people, including at Maidan, were surprised at the strength and spontaneity of the response to the rejection of these agreements, which were technical, obviously had a lot of symbolic value, but these events were surprising and took surprising turns. And then, of course, what Yanukovych did probably encouraged, further enraged and emboldened the opposition. And then that created the opportunity for Putin to act swiftly. So I don't think that this particular scenario was preconceived and it developed the way it did. On the other hand, I would just say that, from the very beginning, and we were talking earlier about this very first meeting, which I think took place in 2000, the first summit, it was in Moscow, and the American reactions were definitely not dealing with Yeltsin anymore, and there were some genuine concerns and some arms control agreements and hopes for last-minute deals were scuttled at that time. So whether that means we had an accurate view or not is different. Whether things have changed over time depending on circumstances is another point to keep in mind. And and this I do at my own tremendous peril, because I'm not a scholar of the divisions within Ukraine. Although I did visit recently, and when I was ambassador to Poland, I would say that my family was Polish, which is true because they were from the Habsburg Empire. But for the purposes of this, I'll say they're Ukrainian, and I can get both sides of the family. I can credibly say that. But and my visits there were very showed to me less anti-Russian hostility, although I'm sure this has intensified since November, but just people fed up with, to your original point, Keith, the governance of Ukraine, whoever was in charge, whether they were pro-Russian or anti-Russian. And I think it needs to be said, in a revolutionary situation, given the provocations, the difficulty, the fact that people are being tested in new circumstances for the very first time, there's been a tremendous amount of restraint that's been shown by the Ukrainian government.
Well, I think that is a really important point. One thing that is also striking is the extent to which Ukraine has immediately been put in this very almost old paradigm of sort of the West versus Russia, and I think one thing I'm interested in is to what extent is that a relevant context for talking about this. We were talking about Ukrainian politics, which clearly hasn't gotten a lot of attention here, and I think goes directly to the question of how stable of a state can there be? What are the politics that could shape future events? But I'm also struck by the fact that the sort of anti-Americanism, the playbook that has been used in Moscow is not something that was made up in the West. Is not something that was sort of Washington being overly touchy or invented. If you look at what has actually been said over the last few weeks in Russia, I think it's pretty extraordinary to anybody who has lived there, who has spent time there. This is a marked rupture from anything that we've seen before. So even the effort to create a narrative whereby the United States, here you have Barack Obama, who's being sort of whacked here in Washington for having been passive and basically done nothing, and never really turned his gaze toward Eastern Europe. To the vast part of his presidency, at the same time has been elevated into this sort of Machiavellian mastermind of this elaborate plot to freeze out the Russians. So it's obviously not something that we're making up here in Washington. I'm curious what each of you makes of that. What strikes from a distance is a very sort of odd and stale kind of Cold War playbook, this narrative of America and the West. Is it really all about domestic politics in Russia, do you think, and Putin shoring up his support there, or is there something broader and more troubling about Russia putting this in a U.S. versus Russia context?
Yeah, so I think that Ukraine doesn't have, it doesn't necessarily have to have this east-west cleavage. But if you activate that cleavage, the South and East go with Russia, and the West and to some extent the center go with Europe and the US. And so the Russians have an interest in activating that cleavage right now, actually. And so we shouldn't help them in that, right? And to the extent that this could be kept a dialogue about, better governance within Ukraine and more representative governance within Ukraine, I think we would gain the South and the East. But the Russians, they, at this point, with this government, they want cleavage. They don't want it to be stable. They don't want it to get roots in the South and the East. And they want to gin up support among their own population for any future incursion that might occur. That's how I see it's state-controlled media, so it's not like these people are doing it on their own. They're trying to build support for potentially doing something further within Ukraine that they might think is strategically necessary. And I think, to me, that signals they think it might be strategically necessary.
Yeah, well, it certainly has been quite astonishing just to see things, including threats of turning us all into radioactive dust last weekend, I believe. One thing to keep in mind is that even that there has been, Susan, you made the comment that it's a unique situation that Ukraine is put in this position of being in a zero-sum West versus Russia game. I think Russia has seen it that way for a long time, and that our Western repeated attempts at saying that it isn't that zero-sum competition were never really believed. So I don't think that frame in terms of Ukraine is new over there. Now, that all having been said, the extent to which the anti-Americanism has been dialed up in the context of what has happened is extreme. I think most of it is, in fact, motivated by mobilizing a domestic population that could well be facing significant economic hardships as a result of the leadership's decisions, and also it falls, of course, on sympathetic ears, given what we know about Russian public opinion. All that having been said, it fits into a broader fact of what the Russian actions have set in motion processes that are different than the world as we knew it a month and a half ago, or even a month ago. And we don't know exactly where those will lead. If this kind of anti-American hysteria on state-controlled television in Russia maintains itself for a protracted period of time, that can have a profound effect on public attitudes and perhaps over time policy. It might box policymakers in, even if they did want to de-escalate, as the term is now, the favorite term in this town at this point. So it is certainly troubling.
Yeah, I want to make sure we get to some questions from the audience, but if you want to weigh in. So please identify yourself and do make it a question if you can, sir.
Hi, my name is Paul Friche.
We have a microphone.
Hi, my name is Paul Friche. Thanks very much for three excellent and very complimentary presentations. I mean, some of you on the panel know me. I was head of the Russia-Ukraine department of the NATO International Staff during the Orange Revolution, and Deputy Secretary General of the OSCE during the 2008 war in Georgia. So I've been somewhat bemused by a lot of the comparisons with past historical events that I've been reading over the past couple of months. But I would like to ask the panel about three distinct impressions that I have based in that experience. One goes to misreading Putin. And for me, I think the question is not so much misreading Putin as having systematically chosen not to read Putin. That we've had a series of opportunities where President Putin, President Medvedev, other representatives of the Russian leadership have made very clear that they were dissatisfied with the status quo, that they have a series of grievances that are not Cold War grievances, that are, as they perceive them, post-Cold War grievances that started with the Kosovo crisis and moved on from there. That in their view, they were being subject to an emerging Euro-Atlantic security order where one set of states made the rules and the rest, including Russia, were expected to abide by them, and that they weren't happy with that. If you go back to President Putin's statement at the Bucharest NATO-Russia Council Summit in 2008, I mean, there's even an explicit reference to the possibility that if NATO followed through with its intentions toward Ukraine, that Russia might take Crimea. And there seems to have been a conscious choice to just sort of write that off as Vladimir Vladimirovich blowing off steam. And I wonder if the panel thinks that we could have handled that differently. The second and third impressions relate to comparisons that are being drawn to the 2008 war in Georgia. As both you, Sam, and Keith have noted, there have been a lot of false comparisons that people have been throwing around. There are two that I, as someone who had a front row seat to watch that event, would draw that haven't really been talked about. One encouraging, one not so much, but they're related to each other. The first relates to the scope of Russian military ambitions and the likelihood of an occupation of eastern and southern Ukraine beyond Crimea. And here I would draw a line. We've been throwing around the term invasion a lot, but I would draw a line between sort of military forays across the border, individual raids, and an actual intention to permanently occupy and hold territory. And here, for all the talk of Russian expansionism, what Russia has accomplished militarily since 2008 has been to consolidate control over 3 tiny bits of territory that it already occupied. And where it enjoyed massive public support that, as Keith noted, it would not enjoy, even in Donetsk and Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk. So I don't think that there's anything concrete that would suggest a risk tolerance that would support a Russian attempt to annex parts of Ukraine where it could face a serious counterinsurgency. And the related point has to do with what you, Sam, described as the action-reaction dynamic. The fact in Georgia in 2008, the fact that Russia made a brief feint toward Tbilisi. Russia executed a very precise military plan in Georgia, in Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. That plan included a conscious feint toward Tbilisi that was widely advertised over open radio frequencies that was designed to draw Georgian military forces away from the conflict areas and to retreat back to the capital, and it worked. And as soon as it worked, the Russian forces turned around and then went about their business consolidating their security zones around Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But the hysteria that accompanied the prospect that Russia was going to swallow Georgia whole and take Tbilisi and depose Saakashvili and impose regime change created a dynamic in which the new normal in which Georgia was permanently divided and Russia had consolidated control over Abkhazia and South Ossetia became acceptable. And I see the same kind of thing happening now in Ukraine vis-a-vis Crimea, that we seem to be moving to a place where, because there's so much hysteria that the whole today Simferopol, tomorrow Tallinn narrative that doesn't really have a lot of grounding in concrete reality, is making a tacit acceptance of permanent Russian occupation and annexation of Crimea a sort of acceptable middle ground. And I'm wondering if you see any way to move away from that.
Lots to unpack there. I want to do this pretty quickly so we can get at least a couple other questions from the
Yeah. I think Russia thinks about Ukraine differently than it thinks about Georgia. I don't think it cared much about Georgia. I think it cares much more about Ukraine, and particularly about the Russian-speaking population. So I agree with your reading, which is that I hope they understand how difficult it would be to occupy southern and eastern Ukraine. Beyond Donetsk and Luhansk, those might go well, like Crimea, but the rest, no. But I don't think that I don't think we should compare it with Georgia in the sense that I think their ambitions with respect to Ukraine are much more sizable because they care much more about the way the country goes.
I would just thank you, Paul, for those very interesting comments. The one thing I would respond to is this first point about not reading Putin/Medvedev and the list of grievances that they've aired over the years. I guess I would say, even if you had read them, you might be able, there was an attempt to manage those grievances, even if one didn't take the threats that were either implied or explicit seriously. That management effort, which came in the form of the NATO-Russia Council, among many other things, really hit a dead end several years ago, and created an environment where the issue that I'm having here is that you can't draw a straight line from the grievances to this action, and I think that there are other factors that came into play to allow that to happen, including the way in which the grievance management process sort of fell apart over the course of the last 5 to 10 years.
Very briefly, just also on the other side of this question, and I know, thank you. On the other side of this question, and I know that there are a whole range of different views about this, and I don't reject those either. But I mean, it's worth noting that there was some NATO activity which was of interest that wasn't exactly welcomed by Moscow at this time, which was intended to kind of reaffirm the Article 5 commitment, and some of that hasn't been widely appreciated. One of which was establishment of contingency plans in 2009, which didn't exist with the newer members before. Some people say those are insufficient, but they're infinitely more sufficient than the non-existent contingency plans that predated them. There was missile defense, and that's come up in the news recently, but the new missile defense plan is endorsed much more warmly by the newer NATO members than the one that pre-existed it, despite the problems and how it was announced. And then there's a small but significant new U.S. Air Force Aviation Detachment in Poland, which was the first full-time presence of American troops in the country, and that's now proving to be of some significance. So there have been moves in this direction, even though they haven't been headlined or emphasized perhaps as much as some people might have wanted.
So we promised to get you out there and back into the snow, but why don't I take 2 quick questions, we'll do them together, and then we'll have a final answer. So you, sir, and then you, sir.
Hi, my name's Evan Smith. I work for Doug Schoen. This is for Professor Darden, although any of you are welcome to jump in. As far as what you characterize as simple solutions, probably won't be as simple to get to them. Do you see any indication from the current government that they would jump for a federalization or even a autonomization plan for the East and the West? And what can we do in the West to get them there, especially considering that Western Ukraine without access to the central budget is probably not economically viable, considering that I don't think a single Habsburg state former Habsburg province is a donor to the central budget.
Thank you. And then we'll take these 2 right here.
I'm Caitlin Antrim with the Rule of Law Committee for the Ocean. Coming from a maritime strategy background, I've always looked at Crimea as important because of its naval base, not just to the base to Russia, but to denying it to Western powers. So my first reaction in all of this has been, why haven't I heard anyone talking about that? It gets into issues of control of population, economics of Ukraine. But to me, looking at that, I've wondered for almost 20 years how that was going to be resolved. Every time the base had to be renegotiated, every time there was a conflict, every time the United States sends a destroyer in for freedom of navigation exercises in the Black Sea, this has come up. and yet it doesn't come up in all of the discussion over the last 2 months. I don't think I've heard that mentioned on television at all. Am I missing something here? Has it suddenly become unimportant? Or is it not being addressed because people have other areas of focus?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ali Wan. I'm an associate with the Belfer Center. I wanted to actually build off a great feature that Political magazine did not too long ago, kind of putting Putin on the couch and trying to get inside his head, probe his motives. And I wanted to ask what your interpretation or assessment is of this perception, maybe not the predominant one, but certainly a prevalent perception in the West that Putin is kind of this grand strategic thinker, he's a chess master, and in a lot of the cartoons about the Ukrainian crisis, it shows Putin sort of playing chess against sort of a hapless set of opponents. When you look at the incursion into Crimea and perhaps the longer context of Putin's time in power, how do you rate him as a strategic thinker?
These are good questions. I do want to get quickly in the back, Andre.
I'd like to make only 3 short comments. First one concerning the reading or misreading Mr. Putin. The decision to take over Ukraine has been taken by Mr. Putin and presidential administration in Kremlin in year 2003. It's a decision. The detailed military plan to occupy Ukraine has been published in Russian press openly in spring year 2008, with all details, with the first stage of Crimea that has been fulfilled in front of our eyes recently. Second point, concerning the kind of breakout of this agreement of February 21st. It has been destroyed by decision of Mr. Putin on Mr. Putin instructed Mr. Yanukovych and Mr. Yarosh, and they have performed this signing an immediate run of Mr. Yanukovych. It was an instruction according, just given over phone to Mr. Yanukovych on the same day. And Mr. Yanukovych started to evacuate his Межигорье estate 2 days before that, so it has been planned long before. And the third comment concerning Crimea, this operation could not be so successful if not agreement that has been achieved between Mr. Putin and part of the Ukrainian government, current Ukrainian government, about allowing Mr. Putin to capture Crimea. And as you can follow the decisions of the Ukrainian government, they did everything possible that Mr. Putin did it smoothly, without any shot, and so on. So that just the picture is slightly more complicated, and I think it would be useful for any strategic planning to have all these facts in mind. Thank you.
For all these terrific questions, it's always proof in Washington that the audience is usually as engaging as the panel. I'm going to give everybody a chance to respond to as much of these as we can, and get you back out there in the snow and on your way.
Is how viable is decentralization or federalization and the solutions that I put out there? I think they're viable because we have much more leverage over the government in Kiev than we do over the government in the Kremlin. And so those are, fairly reasonable reforms that are being demanded within the country. And let's not forget that that's about half the population that would like to see those reforms, and that's the economic power base in the country. So I think they're on pretty strong footing for pushing that issue. It's been discussed extensively in the Ministry of Finance, and it's sort of percolating its way up. With a little bit of external pressure, I think they could happen quite easily. And it's not non-viable from an economic perspective either. It's not true that Lviv is a net payer into the federal budget, and so that could anchor the finances of the West. You have sort of key regions in each part of the country that are net payers, and they could allow for decentralization to occur economically as well. Mr. Larionov, I think if there are 2 ways to respond to what you're saying. Either you have perfect information and no one else does, or I think we don't really know necessarily what the Kremlin design was. The U.S. government has lots of military plans for lots of contingencies. That doesn't mean that we're rolling those things out, in a steady stream over a period of years. I'm sure we have plans for defending Canada by putting U.S. troops on that soil, but that doesn't mean we're going to invade Canada. So I think that there's a strong case to be made that this was contingent, There are, and they speak English.
You just made headlines in Ottawa.
I often do. So I do think that we need to look at this as a crisis that evolved, and I think that we can de-evolve it along similar lines if we recognize there were certain buttons that got pushed. I think the point about Crimea and the base, Dmitry Gorenberg of CNA has written extensively about this, and I sort of follow his blog very closely in these discussions. So I agree it hasn't been discussed as much in the popular press, but experts have been discussing it. And I think part of why Russia took Crimea was to, in many ways, reduce the potential costs of change in Kiev for them. This is a big deal for them. Strategically, it's a very important base. And just by taking Crimea out of the picture, they didn't care quite so much how things went in Kiev. So it was a sort of odd de-escalation in their mind, which reveals Putin is not a great strategic thinker because it escalated everywhere else.
On that note, yeah, I would just add that the agreements that I referred to that would have, in Moscow's view, come under threat after February 21st included, as I mentioned, the Kharkiv agreements, which were the deal that Putin, or at that point I guess it was Medvedev, struck with Yanukovych in 2010 to extend the Black Sea Fleet lease, which would have expired in 2017 to 2042. 2017 is not, too long from now. So presumably, with the Kharkiv agreements torn up, that would have been a relatively immediate concern that they would have been dealing with. So I certainly agree with Keith on that score. I think this Putin the grand strategist narrative is completely ridiculous for any number of reasons. I mean, even if we just end up with a situation where, as seems to be the Paul's scenario, whereby we sort of the occupation and annexation of Crimea is something we're going to be dealing with for a long time, but that's it. Effectively, he will have gotten Crimea and lost Ukraine. Moreover, it's the end of a deeper and broader customs union / Eurasian Economic Union. I mean, elites throughout the former Soviet region are not sleeping very much these days, as you might imagine, and no degree of economic coercion can completely overcome probably the extent of their anxieties right now. Further, he's threatened Russia's international integration, which has been a project, despite his rhetoric, that even he has pursued since returning to office, and that, frankly, is one of the few significant major policy accomplishments of his presidency, including the convertibility of the ruble in 2006, and so on and so forth, that might all be undone within a matter of weeks. So I just don't, I mean, if it's chess, it seems more instinctive of a knocking it off of the board than a real playing of a game. I'll just mention, in terms of the other comments we heard about Sikorsky, Foreign Minister Sikorsky's version of, Polish Foreign Minister Sikorsky's version of events on February 21st, which was that it was only a phone call from Putin that got Yanukovych to sign the agreement to begin with. So that he would then scupper it does seem a little bit strange to me, but I don't have that information, so I can't say anything else to it. Lee?
I don't have that information either. Well, I just want to say about the strategy of Putin. I think what he's demonstrated is an ability to act quickly when he perceives openings, and that's been impressive. The degree to which that will be to his long-term advantage, I think, is very much open to question. And I would agree both with Keith and Sam on this point that I think this is not an outcome that over the long term looks like it will go to his advantage, particularly given the fact that he sees Ukraine very much in zero-sum terms, and his main foreign policy goal and legacy is to reestablish a customs union, and this, it seems to me, these events make that less likely rather than more likely.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out this morning. Thank you very much, and what a great conversation. And as for Canada, time will tell.